streaky. Because like if you watch that first quarter, it's like he was missing, is like all over, throwing guys' feet, and he wasn't seeing the field. And then all of a sudden, it just clicked, and he was on fire. I mean, I don't know if that seems accurate to you, but
Yeah, he reminds me, he's kind of, I think there are certain players who are just robotic, the Peyton Mannings and the
Mhm.
Tom Brady's, and, they are, very much kind of built on mechanics. And as long as they trust their mechanics, it is what it is. And then there are players who just like have to get into a feel and a groove, kind of just like a basketball player who's like,
Right.
put up a couple shots and, just has to touch the ball a little bit, maybe dribble a little bit, and then kind of, get a little bit more comfortable. I feel like he's like that. So I don't know. To me, I think if I were like Andy Reid, I'd like, get him involved in some like rollouts early on, some like
Yeah.
action pass, some bootlegs, just to get his kind of feet moving, something like real simple and easy, a couple of little layups here and there. And then that, I think, will kind of settle him down, allow him to kind of get in this groove. But I think when you just kind of have him just like drop back or, and just sort of kind of have him go straight through, to his, having to go through progressions early on, I think it makes it tough for him
Yeah,
to get.
like he's nervous or he's jumpy. I agree. Yeah, if you got to move, because he's so good on the move too. It
Yeah.
seems obvious whenever I'm like, Andy, come on, man. Like you can script plays better than that. I know I couldn't do any better, but it's just like, what are we doing? It's always like that. But
Kyler,
yeah,
to a lesser degree, is like that too as well. He's not as talented as a thrower. He has
mhm.
like the arm strength and all that, but he's not as just kind of talented as a thrower in terms of like touch and all that. But he's like that too. I feel like, he's someone that's like he's not getting into a groove. He didn't have like a few like little layups and bunnies. Like he's just going to be flustered the entire game. You
Yeah.
know. So, but we'll see.
Yeah, at least it was a good result. I mean, not for Kyler, but at least for Mahomes, it
Yeah,
worked out. I
exactly.
feel like that it's sort of like the Super Bowl. I don't know if you feel that way, but it's like I feel like whoever wins that game is definitely going to the Super Bowl. I don't know about winning the Super Bowl, but I just don't think that the Titans or Bengals is going to stop either one of them.
I think it's likely. I mean, the thing about the Titans is, their defense, as far as like them being, well coached and well schemed and being able to, adjust from game to game. And is, I think we look at their roster and, we don't see, all the big studs, or it just doesn't look good,
Hmm.
but they're just so well coached. And they, oftentimes, I think they get up for these big games that that they'll be in it. So to me, their defense is, coming into their own, and they've been better than last year. So I'm not putting it past them to
Yeah,
make the Super Bowl.
I
But
mean they'll be
Bills,
at home if they're there. So
yeah, the way the Bills played last week, though, I mean, that they look scary. They look
they do. There were
scary.
little flashes of scary from the Chiefs, but Bills definitely look like
Yeah,
the one to beat. So.
yeah.
Well, thanks for so much for coming on, man. I don't know exactly how this recording is going to come out, but we're going to just get it rolling. This is Grinding the Data. Thank you so much for being on here with us. If you're new with us, my name is Kevin Scott, and this is the first in our off-season podcast, like expert series. It's still a young podcast, kind of getting rolling here, and typically we look at data and some things that'll help you week to week win your fantasy matchups. This expert series is kind of zoom out and pick the brain of some experts in the space, whether it's players or analysts or both, and just kind of learn about their process, their strategy, how they feel like things have shifted this year into next year, and what we can learn from all that. And so today we have the first ever guest to Grinding the Data, Abib Agbetoba. Welcome, sir.
Kevin, thanks for having me, man. Feel ecstatic to be here. Season's almost done, but as you know, football never stops. The
That's
grind
right.
never stops.
Yeah, and in case you don't know who Abib is, first of all, is an awesome guy, one of the nicest guys I've met through fantasy. It's been a privilege to kind of have a friendship over the past year or two. He's also a very busy surgeon in Texas. Definitely a smart guy, also funny, cool, which isn't always the case for doctors, I assume. But has a playful approach to fantasy. As we've talked through drafts and strategy, man, something I've noticed about your fantasy game is that you're just always experimenting, always willing to try something new, sort of work the angles. I remember the first draft we had together this year, you were like, yeah, I'm going to try Kelsey and then 6 backs in a row. Like, I think that might work. And I'm like you've already thought through this and you know what you're going to do here. That's fascinating. And you did, and unfortunately, you hit a few guys that were out for the
Yeah.
season. But still, you took me out in that playoff, so it's painful. Clearly, he's good. He's taken me out several times, but I beat him a couple times. But
Yep.
I think you got a winning record against me. Most thing that Abib is known for, though, is winning the Football Guys Championship twice in a row, which is something that's never been done, never will be done again. Probably had to beat 13,000 other teams twice in a row. So quite an accomplishment. I think a lot of people are probably curious, since we're just starting this off season, how this season went for you. A lot of people I saw reaching out to you say, "Is the three-peat going to happen?" How did things turn out for you this year?
Yeah, it was okay. It was kind of an up and down year. I think for the most part, pretty much a wash. Obviously, with the amount of success that I've been fortunate to have over the last few years, pretty much anything outside of winning it all was going to be, somewhat of a disappointment. So, and even last year, you just have to understand like how much goes in to be able to win. And yeah, you draft a great team, you manage waivers, you make some, right start sit decisions, but a tremendous amount of just kind of, luck and just things that are completely out of your control need to happen for you to kind of reach that spot. So I can't be obviously too upset for not winning it this year, but I think all in all, I think I had slightly over 50 plus teams, and about 20 of those were in the Football Guys. So really, all you want is as many bullets as possible in that tournament, and then whatever happens, happens. I mean, Burrow and Chase weren't all stars, and they weren't dominating before entering that tournament, but they had just an amazing 3-week stretch, and so that's just kind of what you're hoping for, is just to kind of have enough, have one of those or two of those players that really go off that last 3 weeks. But being able to play and just coming close to breaking even or just like slightly above even, like I'll take that any year because it's just so much fun.
It's like free entertainment at that point. Yeah, if you make money at it, it's beautiful. Yeah,
absolutely.
that's cool. Well, it was. I've mentioned on here on the podcast and on Twitter, one of my hardest years ever. I think there was so much that went into that, but so much of it was the COVID stuff and the injuries that were a little extra, and even like you said, some of the guys that went off in the end were terrible during the season. So you might have drafted those guys. That's what made those people who won the championship. It's going to be a fascinating thing to look back at how did they do it, because you had to almost either just hit on the perfect, threading the needle kind of thing, or you have enough guys from who was hot and then who got hot late that you kind of patch it together. So it'll be interesting to look at that. So we're going to jump in here to some of these main topics of discussion, and we won't talk about all these questions that I sent you, but we'll jump into however many we can, and I'm going to discuss these with several other experts in the space and just kind of see where it takes us. So the first question I wanted to ask you about is, as you sort of, like you were just talking about who kind of would have made it this year, but as you look at your leagues, or just you've seen other leagues and studied that, what do you think the primary reason that most 2021 championship teams won? Like, do you think it was a great draft? Do you think it was just good luck with COVID stuff or waiver wire? Kind of what do you think was the main factor there?
Yeah. So I guess as I answer this, I'm going to exclude the large field tournament aspect of things and just kind of look at just the primary league. So even if you were in a high stakes, just winning your league, I think if you won your league, you probably didn't necessarily have to have a great draft, given all the injuries that occurred, and given how some of the, there were a handful of players that just really exceeded expectations that you were able to get into mid to later rounds. So I think if you were fortunate enough, either you were on or the player fell to you, you just decided to take them just because best available. If you ended up with guys like Cup, Debo, or some combination of, I think that really sets you apart. Being able to get guys like that who can really produce at first round value in rounds 5 and later is such an advantage over the field. So that's one. I think the second thing, especially in this year where, like you mentioned before, COVID, the amount of injuries that were piling up, and just, I mean, there were just, some wild things that happened. I think being able to manage waivers appropriately was very, very important this year, more so than I can remember in years past, and deciding which players to hold on to, and sort of kind of ride it out versus which players to drop, which players to take a chance on. We saw guys like Monroe St. Brown who didn't do anything for for much of the year, and then really came on strong and ended up being a league winner. And those decisions, those whether or not you're going to take a shot on those types of players, that is a very, very tough, sort of kind of a tough thought process to go through as you're constructing your team, especially if it's a short benched league. So I think getting some value guys in the mid rounds, managing waivers appropriately and hitting on some of those key guys, and just grinding the waiver wire is likely what ended up getting many of us championships, or costing many of us championships, looking at the contrast of that.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to say that, if you didn't get one of those players that turned into a huge value, it would have been difficult to win your league, right? I mean, if you didn't get Cup or Debo or, at tight end, some of those guys that outperformed expectations, that, I don't know how you would win it. And like you said, maybe you hit on all the waiver wire work. If you hit on Elijah Mitchell, but you didn't pick up the Ravens backs that all crapped out, and you picked up the right, like you're saying, rookie receiver, but not the wrong one, like Terrace Marshall, whoever else got dropped. Yeah, it's just there were a lot of landmines out there. So yeah, it seems like it was you had to kind of put everything together this year to win any league.
And I felt like this year, and every year is unique, and sometimes maybe a little bit of recency bias, but I really try to kind of remove myself from what happened last week, or what recently happened, and really try to take a look from a high 30-foot view to try and get a good sense of what was going on. But I felt like this year, when it came to the amount of coaching changes, head coaches, offensive, defensive coordinators, the amount of player changes, the injuries preseason, and specifically the influx of talent from the collegiate level that were immediately thrusted into starting roles, there was just a lot of unknown. And so those first few weeks of the season were so important to try to figure out what was going on. But then you had to quickly adjust as well. Because what may be right weeks 1 through 3 could be completely wrong weeks 4 through 7, and then right again weeks 8 through 11. So it's just this, and that's what I love about it. It's, I think if you're approaching fantasy football from like a static point of view, that, okay, this is what I need to do to succeed, and I'm going to do this and follow, you need to be very dynamic and nimble and sort of kind of be able to adjust, because the league is ever evolving and ever changing. And if you can't change with it and evolve and adjust with it, I think it puts you at a disadvantage.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Yeah, and I guess along with that, if we just zoom in of all the things that you could have done, that would have really set you up to win this year, and we just think about drafting, and you and I love to draft, obviously, a lot of high volume players. It's one of the best parts.
Yeah.
Grinding the waiver wire is probably it's like golf, like. You drive for show, putt for dough. Like the waiver wire is probably with like putting, but man, driving is like the draft, right? Like it's so fun and it's awesome. It's so interesting, so many different ways to do it. And I guess I wanted to ask you, like, if we zoom in, we think about all those different strategies. People talk about it constantly in the off season. Like, should you go heavy running back? Should you go zero running back? Should you take one running back? And like all these different names, hero RB, and should you take a QB early or tight end early? I guess. From you did a lot of drafts. I mean, 50 plus. What do you think worked best this year? Or as you looked at the winners of these big contests, what do you think worked for them, or even just individual leagues? What do you think was the most effective strategy?
Honestly, I don't think there was necessarily one strategy that was better than the other. You draft players that score points and that don't get injured. And if you're fortunate enough to kind of be able to like have them be consistent throughout the year, then you win. You could have gone zero RB and ended up with guys like Ridley and Hopkins and a plethora of others, AJ Brown, Michael Thomas earlier in the year. So, and then even, some of the guys that, like the, CeeDee Lamb of the world. Keenan Allen was good this year, but was he really, sort of, this, huge difference maker? That's tough to say. And then I always ask, for patients, or for for fantasy players who go zero RB, how long did you wait before you drafted a running back? And when you did that, say it was round 5 or 6 that you started looking at running backs. Well, that means you, especially in some of the home leagues, you probably missed out on guys like Debo and Cup. So for me, again, it really just kind of depends on the player, because if you drafted Jonathan Taylor and Austin Eckler at the or Najee Harris at the back end of the first round, you were very happy. And if you were able to get a Cooper Cup and a Debo on that squad, you did amazing. And then, rounded it out with the Mark Andrews. So I'm really not so much to, going zero RB or RB heavy. I like running backs. The reason that I like running backs, I like good running backs, I should say. I don't like drafting running backs just to draft running backs. So if I'm sitting in the 5th or 6th round and it's, Myles Gaskin, and I don't, if we kind of remember back to, draft season, Brandon. Yeah, even in retrospect, I'm still going to take probably Brandon Ayuk, because I just didn't have a lot of confidence in a Gaskin. So I want good running backs that I'm confident in, or that I want to take a chance on. But outside of that, I just think it just comes down to drafting players that you feel confident in. And for me, a big thing is I don't necessarily focus so much on upside, or the idea or the way that people talk about upside anyway. I focus more on having a high consistent floor, because any player, any given week, can put up 20 plus points. Any player. You name me one player that, that is the, quote unquote safe player with low upside, with a low, low ceiling. And I can point out and cherry pick weeks where they blew up. And conversely, someone like a McCole Hardman, who's everybody's darling, to, have a high upside and have this high, the potential to really explode, injury or no injury, you see a lot of low peaks. So I don't want to play that guessing game. Too much can, happen. So I try to minimize the variance in my play. But, kind of a long-winded answer of saying, draft who's going to score the most points.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, so you would say that when you're drafting, outside of all these strategies, one of the main things you think about is, probable number of touches per week, right?
Yep,
like work
absolutely.
that they're going to get, whether receiver or running back or tight end.
Yeah. And it's funny, so kind of bring up you brought in, some quote unquote analytics. And I'm not a big analytics person, and I say that meaning that that's not part of my process, but that's not saying that I don't use it. So I use guys like you, Dwayne McFarland, or a number of other guys who do use analytics, and I like to marry the two approaches. But in the end, what I find is that if you're really watching the games and you're really, you're kind of in it day to day, and you've been doing this for a few years, and most of us have, and you're a competitive person, oftentimes the analytics match up almost exactly with what you're seeing. Yep. So I don't need to know specifically how many touches per week a certain player is going to get. If I watch the game and I see that not only are they using him out of the backfield, they're using him on bubble screens, he's lining up wide a couple times, there's enough there that I'm seeing where I can kind of, come to the conclusion that this player is going to get touches, both carries and, and potential targets and receptions, and will move up my board as a result. And so I don't think the two are, mutually exclusive. I think oftentimes they're telling the same story just in a different way.
Yeah. So if you look back, and maybe you'd have to go and look at all the data to know the answer to this question, but just curious, because I agree with your statement that there is no right way to draft. There is not even a most effective strategy. In some years, certain strategies are going to be most effective based on how the board falls, probably, but you can be successful with any of them. But if you look back at your drafts, would you say that one of them would have been how you drafted mostly? I mentioned the draft where you had the one tight end and then a bunch of backs, and then you went 8 receivers in a row. I mean, did you have any sort of thing you were trying out the most that you felt good about, or was there not really?
Yeah. So year in and year out, especially with how the league is just sort of kind of moved, we're seeing, a lot more 3 wide receiver sets, 4 wide receiver sets at times. I find that, finding that gem of a wide receiver in the mid to later rounds is a lot easier than finding the running back. And finding that gem of a running back oftentimes ends up being a handcuff, or someone who just sort of kind of comes out of nowhere, who's going in the later rounds anyway. So oftentimes my approach, unless there's a player that I just like, love at value, Davante Adams in the late first round, for example. Oftentimes my approach is really trying to get as many bell cow running backs as possible early on, typically three, and then attacking, wide receiver from there. And I usually try to cheat on tight end. I do try to find that, diamond in the rough. But so if there's a running back that I can identify in the third round, that's typically, what'll be my approach. And then if the running backs in the first two rounds are guys that I'm just like not in on, or guys that I'm going to fade, then that's when I'll, pivot to the wide receiver. And for me, for someone who drafts quite a few teams, obviously I do want to, incorporate some diversification, not to the point where I'm, grabbing players just to say that I have a share. These are still players that I want to believe in, but rather than, going Austin Eckler for, 10 times out of 10, I'll say, okay, let me get some Tyreek Hill here. Let me get some Devontae, some more Devontae Adams here. Let me take a stab at Kelsey, and try and, mix it up a little bit from guys that I still think will produce, but maybe goes away from that, kind of, people want to call it RB robust. And so for me this year, the only really third round running back that I cared about was DeAndre Swift. And everyone else was just sort of kind of a fade. So many of my teams I'd probably say the majority of my teams, it's hard to put a number on it. Maybe, say anywhere from 40 to 50% probably started off with two RBs and then a wide receiver. And then if I was able to get Swift, and it was 3 RBs and then, wide receiver. I tried. It's hard to go 4 running backs in a row. It's not really a strategy I like to do. Sometimes I'll, like you said, play around with it, but that's pretty infrequent. I had one team that actually, did fairly well, just, tapered off towards the end, where I went, I had Kelsey, Kittle, and then I came back and chose the wrong tight end. I think it was my third tight end. I can't recall. I had three or four tight ends on that team, but instead of getting Mark Andrews, it was, whoever was who's after him.
Like Hawkinson or one of those guys.
Yeah, one of those guys. I think it may have been Goddard or someone who I guess really wasn't like an early round tight
Fant
end.
really killed me too in some leagues.
Yeah. So I'll play around from that standpoint, but that's more so because I'm in a high stakes and I'm looking for ways that, okay, these are some guys that I can see, who can put up some monster 3-week stretches, but still get me to the tourney. So
yeah, that's good. Very cool. As of now, sort of early in the off season, as you think about 2022 drafts that I'm sure will start and not too far away, do you feel like you're probably approach it the same way, like same general strategy, or did you feel anything happen this season that'll make you, at least try some new strategies?
I think for the most part, my process will change just a tad bit. Last year, I definitely took off quite a bit of time as far as, just kind of really removing myself from anything sports related, just, to, just kind of get away from a little bit, take a little bit of a breather. It can be a beat down, as you know. And so I think when I started drafting, I basically just dove right in. I did, very little prep work and just sort of kind of went right in. And I think that was definitely a huge mistake. High stake leagues are nothing to play with. Those guys are just, everyone's just so sharp. So if you're not, ready to draft and you don't know every single player that's in that player pool, you're probably going to have some issues moving forward. So this year, I think I'll still take a little bit of time off, but I'll still, keep my ear, to the streets, keep my Twitter account notifications on, and just kind of follow the process. I don't think we're going to see the same influx of talent from the collegiate level or things shaken up as much as we did last year. And so I'm hopeful that I feel a little bit more comfortable with some of the systems and schemes and players in those schemes than we did last year. But I'll probably what I plan on doing is doing a little bit more review of some of the college guys that are coming out. So I feel just more comfortable with that as opposed to just trying to do a soft fade on them. And then I'm going to do a lot more best ball this year to start off and really follow the draft. So not that meaning when I draft, rather than just looking at my team and trying to construct the best team, I'll earn some cheapy best balls and I'll just follow the draft and see where players are going, players that I, didn't necessarily think should be going that high go back and take a look and try and do,
Hmm.
my formal assessment. Players that are going a little bit later that I think are high, go back, and then players that I just like, didn't even think about, or players that I'm like, I would never draft that guy. This year, I think I'm going to go back and really take a deep dive in. I want to really have a good baseline for my, rankings going into the draft season, and I want to stick with them. It's tough. There's so much out there now when it comes to just fantasy analysis and articles and projections and takes. It's the field is there's just so much information, and so groupthink and having some strong opinions changed and altered. Sometimes yes, it's a good thing, but sometimes it can hurt you. And so I want to have that, and I want to cement it in stone for the most part, unless there's something that comes along that really, really changes my belief. A guy like Jonathan Taylor, who I can recall and remember being on a podcast, and they asked, who's going to stick into your top three, and I mentioned him as one. And by the end of the offseason, at that point I was taking him, in the mid to later, or actually not even the mid round, first round, the later first round, the late first round. So I think I want to set in on that process now. And then when I draft, I'm just going to try to almost erase whatever ADP is.
Right, man. That is always the goal, man.
I'm going to erase it, and I'm just going to, and ideally set my own ADP and then just go off of that. And then that way I can hopefully try to avoid the bias. Because in the end, does it really matter where you took a player, the third or fourth round?
If he hits.
It doesn't.
If he hits, you're golden.
Exactly. So
man, I got some in a couple leagues where I took Cup ahead of Woods. I got a lot of like, oh, what are you doing? That kind of thing. And at the end, you're like, I hit that one. And then I remember, like you're saying, I had a few of those drafts, and then later drafts, I took Woods ahead of Cup. Now, some of that was like, trying to diversify, like you're saying. But if I would just have stuck with my initial rankings, it would have been a lot better. And sometimes, your rankings don't work out. Sometimes your rankings are wrong and you take the guy you like and you miss, but I'd rather have that than like you're saying, listen to group things. That's really good.
Why play the game, based off of someone else's tune? If you're going to play the game, like, and you're really in, especially if you're doing high stakes, like, the reason we play is because we want to prove that we're right. We're the most right anyway.
Right.
That's why we play. So, I think this year, kind of moving this forward this year, I'm gonna not go overboard with it. I never want to have 100% of one player, because you can't predict injuries. But I'm probably going to be a little bit more bullish on guys that I'm high on, and really try and be careful with how I diversify.
Yeah, that's really good. It's interesting. You mentioned the best ball thing. I had a question later on that basically how do you get your rankings in order so that you're ready to draft, and you kind of answered that question. And I know that you'll do a lot of work as far as looking at studying guys and looking at the stats and looking at anticipated targets and all that kind of stuff. But it's interesting that best ball drafting really prepares you and gives you a feel for the board. I find that for me, it's like I don't like best ball, so I'm almost doing the same thing but with high stakes drafts, and then I end up with some of them I like, some of them I don't, but I get a quick feel for the draft board. Sometimes by making some really stupid mistakes, but it really gives you that feel. Yeah, it's a good way. I mean, there's people talk about mock drafts, and there's almost no value to those if there's no skin in the game. So at least with best ball, you're getting a little skin in the game, even if the board might be a little different based on best ball. So that's interesting. Do you think a question for you here, just shifting gears, when you're thinking about your rosters in the leagues, what do you think is the most important? Do you think it's the most important to have a fully optimized, like the best starting lineup you can, and then you'll kind of patch together a bench as you go with the waiver wire? Or would you rather coming out of a draft have a crazy deep roster at back and receiver, like 5 or 6 of each, preferably, that you could start in a given week? What would be your preference?
Yes, it's such a tough question to answer. I would probably say, just based on my style of drafting, if I just kind of looking in at those draft boards, my approach is probably, really trying to go for the gusto, really guys that can produce week in and week out, guys that I feel comfortable with starting almost right away, or guys that I have just, a certain feeling about that I think they can really break out.
Hmm.
And then after that, unless it's like a need on that specific team, that's when I'm, making the pivot towards, okay, I waited at tight end, I got my safe tight end or, guy who can kind of, who I can feel comfortable starting week one. Let me go ahead and grab that tight end that could potentially break out in the later rounds. Or let me now pivot towards these high handcuff running backs. Uh, but that's sort of how I approach it, as opposed to having a deep bench of players that you can slot, the bye week fill-ins. Just because my thought process is, even with a 20 man team or roster, you can still find bye week fill-ins on the waiver wire,
Hmm.
uh, almost constantly. Almost always. Again, bringing up Amon-Ra St. Brown or Alan Lazard. These guys are were on the waivers for
Hmm.
anyone to have at any point from week 10 on. So those guys, I try to leave it to guys who can really be difference makers on the roster, because if something does happen, those are the guys where people end up you know basically unloading their bank and unloading
Hmm.
all of their fab to try and acquire these guys. So I'd rather have those guys on my team and save the money from that standpoint.
Interesting. So you're saying you'd rather a bench that it has high upside that may not be able to play right away, because you could get a guy you can plug in when needed,
Yeah.
and keep your starting roster as awesome as you can get it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, typically, like my starting roster is fairly thin. Like, I have my starters, and then I may have like one or two guys who can, like, if an injury happens, I can put in. Otherwise, I got to go to the waivers,
Hmm.
and I usually have a fair amount of these backup handcuff running backs that are readily available. And I also like to try to have two quarterbacks, and I've been doing that for 3 or 4 years. I remember when I first started drafting. Uh, you know, I can just remember some of the things in the chat rooms about this guy taking two quarterbacks. Why? I was like, this is the position that scores the most points.
Right.
Like, and and I am someone who likes to play the weekly game. Like, I don't necessarily feel like I have to start, these quote unquote studs on a week in and week out basis. Not to mention, sometimes just what we think is going to happen does not happen, and you like to have some of those guys available to you. And then obviously with COVID, I
Yeah.
think most of us are kind of have a backup plan now.
Yeah, it became very important this year. Yeah, and I agree with that strategy. I mean, sometimes I've taken three.
Yeah.
To me, it's all about who falls. I mean, if someone's
Yeah.
going to sit there and leave Joe Burrow in the 15th round, I'll just take him. I'm not going to let you have him.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
very cool. How about blind bidding? And a lot of leagues don't have it, but in a lot of these FFPC and other high stakes leagues, a lot of even home leagues are going to blind bidding now. What do you think is the best way to do that? I've heard some interesting discussions on Twitter about almost all the difference makers being, grabbed up early. And so you should spend your money early. And some people, say, no, you got to save it because everybody runs out and you have
Yeah.
it at the end. What do you think is the best strategy there?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your approach. If you're someone who believes in analytics, then you probably want to spend most of it early, because that's you're going to be able to you get the greatest return on your
Hmm.
investment and on your fab dollars. The earlier you spend it, because you have more weeks obviously to spend it. Uh, I really think the answer, and this is kind of how I approach life in general. It's really just case dependent. It depends on like the league that you're in, the format that you're in. How are other guys spending fabs? If it's
Hmm.
a home league and you've been in it for a few years, you probably have a good sense of like how how people spend money. I'm in a home league that really is what got me into fantasy in general, and these guys are ruthless. They will spend a good majority of their fab just in spite of you. So so it just kind of depends. I tend to be a little bit more aggressive, especially if my team is in need of something.
Yeah,
I'm
that's what I was
gonna
going to say. It depends on the team, right?
Yeah, like for instance, a good example was Michael Thomas. So the teams that I drafted Michael Thomas on, I spent a good chunk of fab trying to get Callaway, and obviously that was a clear miss, but the potential was still there, and I think I'd probably make that decision more oftentimes than not, try and replace that starter that I lost, that third round grade. But I don't think you can argue with someone who wants to, especially if it's someone where it's a season-ending injury and it's a clear backup. Obviously, you may go fairly hard there. The tough thing with some leagues like FFPC, you have to have money to be able to pick a player off of waiver.
Right.
So if you use all of your fab, that can be very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, obviously NFL injuries happen on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis. But COVID, you had to keep your head on a swivel. So there was I definitely had some teams where I did not manage my fab as well as I should have. And then I had some teams where like I didn't manage my fab as well as I should have, but it ended up paying out because the guys that I would have dropped ended up,
they came back around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things, you may just kind of want to look at, take all your teams, look at the end results, do kind of a self-assessment and try and come to your own conclusion based off of that. But it really is league dependent.
Yeah. One thing I've thought about with it is like, do I have a roster that's dominating? If so, like I'm in first place, I'm going to save the fab and just because I don't need to spend it right now. Yeah. And then I end up maybe with a dominant team with the most fab at the end, and I can add somebody late. I mean, at the same time, you could make the argument if you got Elijah Mitchell just sitting there, you grab him, and then the other guys can't grab him. So either way, there's potential pros and cons. But
I think the key to it too is stay ready. # stay ready. That's like that's our motto. So where you're picking these guys up before the masses, before they become the hot thing, before people realize with certainty that they are worth a roster spot. Someone like Cordell Patterson, again, even after week 1 was just there available for $1, $2 bid. So some of these guys, if you can just try to pick up well in advance or a week before or a week ahead. Another great example was when Kareem Hunt went down for the first time.
Right.
We went through and we just added Dearness Johnson just as
everywhere
a speculation for $1. Yes, for $1. Yeah. And so I think even on my good teams, I probably will add or drop a player almost on every single team. It's rare, that I'm not like adding or dropping someone because I'm just looking at my team and I'm just going through like, is there somebody on waivers that could potentially help me out more? Then let me grab them, especially if I can get them for cheap right now.
Yeah, and that's another interesting thing. I was just going to mention, something related to that, and then you say that. I like the churning the roster idea. I like always, grinding, and that's how I'm wired too. I want to pick that guy up before anyone else gets him, before anyone else knows he's even there. And then I got him for free. I love all that. My biggest struggle with it, especially this year, as you were mentioning earlier, some of these guys who, sucked and then they came on. And, if I'd been patient with Amon-Ra, I mean, I had Amon-Ra in a bunch of leagues in the draft. I took him in the 16th, 17th round. And it's hard to keep a rookie, for 8 weeks when he's putting up nothing. But like you were saying, trusting your process. Sometimes I feel like, man, if I just would have trusted and been patient with this guy, he would have hit and it could have been huge. But then you feel like I'm just doing nothing. I'm sitting on my hands when I could be picking these players up. So it's a really tough balance.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, in that particular example, I would not fault you, whatsoever. You had 8 weeks of tape, 8 weeks of data. At some point you just got to move on. It's funny, these players that we talk about that we may be high on and that everyone calls a bust, at some point you're going to be right. At some point, a player is going to go off in a given game, and you're going to say, "See, that's why I drafted him." The question, though, and the question you have to answer, I think that we have to like ask ourselves, or the process that we have to sort of kind of go through is, like you said, is it worth holding on to this guy to see if that will eventually happen? How long do we wait? And there's a lot in play there in terms of what's available, how your team is doing. How deep your bench is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the fun part of fantasy. And that's the part, where it's going to be hard to be 100%. If drafting is difficult, managing your roster, especially when it's a deep bench league, is got to be, next level above that.
Mhm.
Deciding on guys like this, what do you do with them?
Yeah. Yeah, and it is. And it's a hard game, and that's what
Yeah.
makes it fun. So, yeah. So as far as like again zooming out, just a couple more questions here for you. If you think of the season as a whole, and maybe some of your failures often teach us more than successes, but just thinking about like maybe strategically, or how you approach the season, that you feel like I'm gonna do that differently next year. You kind of mentioned it with the drafting, just jumping in, and not maybe getting your rankings real down. Was there anything else that you think of that you could be helpful to our listeners? Like, I'm going to remember this. I'm going to learn this and hold it going forward.
Yeah, and this is something that I think is tough, and I'm trying to work on, and I can definitely improve quite a bit on. We talk about the idea of the ambiguous backfields, the running backs, and I have a tendency to really just sort of gravitate towards one of those guys and just want to go all in.
Hmm.
And it's not just running backs; it's wide receivers as well. We saw the Cup Woods, we saw the Debo Ayuk. We're going to go back and forth with that, but what I need to do better is, unless I feel very, very strongly, and there are situations where I do, and I'm okay if I miss if I feel strongly. But if I don't feel strongly, like I know, I mean, maybe some people, I didn't feel strongly Woods versus Cup, but
Hmm.
eventually my mind took me to Woods because it had to rationalize, it had to
Hmm.
sort of kind of think in ones and zeros. It was like binary. You got to go with this or got to go with that, as
Right.
opposed to just thinking that it's a spectrum. Like, both of these guys could succeed, or Cup could succeed, or Woods could get hurt. And that was an easy situation in retrospect to look back on and say, you know what? Why did I not have as much coulds as I did Robert Woods? And the same thing, a big one, a very, very big one, was the Tampa Bay running backs backfield.
Oh
You know,
yeah. Oof. Killed
yeah.
me.
And it took me a while to kind of get to the point where I was in on that backfield. I didn't know who it was going to be, but I wanted the running back that was going to succeed in that backfield. And for whatever reason, my mind took me to Ronald Jones because of, as a pure runner to some
Right.
degree. You know?
And all the stuff on Twitter. He's a way better runner. It's like, well,
Yeah, exactly. But obviously, was that a sure thing? Of course not. I mean, how many times do we see him bench? How many times do we see him at difficulty,
right.
picking up the blitz? And then the most obvious is that Brady loves throwing to his running backs, and he's not a good,
Hmm.
he's not good with his hands. And it was
Right.
one of those things I wanted it to be him because it's
Right.
kind of where my mind took it. And I had zero Fournette. And to me, like, you mentioned, like, I remember my faults, my, where I went wrong. I remember all of those a lot more so than I do like the successes.
Hmm.
It's hard for me to tell you like which teams succeed, but I can give you specific examples of like where I failed. So my failures, like, they stick in my mind. They're just like burned and etched into my brain. And that, not having any Fournette to me was just, was just egregious. Was just malpractice. It was, all of that. So that's something I'm going to be working on this week because those backfields, those situations, that's where you can like, get a leg up on the field. And if you're
Yeah.
not sure, just hedge your bets. That's where I want to diversify. So
Right.
that's definitely what I want to work on.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier about, how do you have these rankings, and then, not draft the same team every time.
Yeah.
And that balance, just like you're talking about with the waiver wire, that balance is the hardest part of drafting. Where it's like, I want to draft according to these beliefs and these rankings. I know why I feel this way, and I want to trust it. In other words, not skip out on Jonathan Taylor at 112 when I had him at the third ranked player, just
Mhm.
because I need to diversify. But if I have too much of him, my season's going to go down in flames, because I had, he got hurt and I had 80% ownership. I mean, so the only players that, I had way too high ownership this season were guys I got late, like Elijah Moore, guys that I loved. And even when I was right, I probably should have diversified more, because I was taking him over guys that I could have gotten that same range that also had better years because they weren't hurt or whatever. So it's hard. Like, you look back and like, oh, I was right about that player, but it still hurt me to be too heavy. And that's where it's like, it's such a hard balance, because you want to trust your gut, But you got to find a way. And there's people listening that just have 1 or 2 leagues, and so for them, just draft the players you like. It's an easy call. Go with your rankings every time. But yeah, for higher volume, you got to diversify. So just one more question for you before we get out of here. Just if you zoom out, think about fantasy football from a really wide lens, all the things that go into, making you a successful fantasy player over the years. What would you say if a listener is listening to you and saying, like, I want to be like Abib, I want to take home a trophy. I don't even care about the 500 grand. I don't even want it. I just want the trophy. Now, I'm sure they want the money. But, how do I become a player like Abib who can, just be consistently good? What would you say is the most important thing for them to become dominant?
Well, I mean, I think that your sentence from a couple of your last sentence or whatever, or the last comment that you made about I don't care about the money. I want the trophy. I want to be the best. I mean, it really starts with that. I mean, obviously we care about the money, but I mean, God, being number one overall, being able to enter a contest and say, I won this. I'm the best fantasy player. There's no feeling like it. I mean, there's like that is just such an awesome feeling. And it just kind of comes from a competitive nature. And I think most of us that play fantasy football, we have that competitive spirit. So if you have that, you're already on your way. I think obviously you got to love football, because if you're not watching the games, if you're reliant on everyone else's analysis and articles and takes and rankings, then you can only be as good as the field.
Right.
So there's just so much that you get from watching it. So much nuance, in terms of watching the entire game, and it's and it just sort of kind of adds on itself. You take a team and like the Pittsburgh Steelers, team that's been consistent in the way they've approached things for a period of years. It makes it a lot easier to draft a Najee Harris in the first round and not think twice about it, because how they've handled running backs throughout this period. Tomlin's thought process when it comes to a bell cow running back. And then you've seen, Ben Roethlisberger sort of kind of progress and how he's incorporated the running back in his. So, but just like watching it, year after year after year, player after player after player, and coaches and et cetera. There's certain things that just don't show up in analytics, but they can help you as whether it's drafting, start sits, or waiver wire ads. So watching film, watching as much football as you can, I think is key and important. And then just don't be afraid to change with the game. Don't be afraid to change up your approach. Don't be afraid to bring in new ideas, to look at different forms of analytics, different ways and ideas of approaching drafting or waivers or anything when it comes to this, because like we brought up before, this game changes. I mean, it changes in season. Every time I bring this up every year with anyone I talk that'll listen, when I talk fantasy football, I just approach the season in quarters, because I know what happens the first 4 weeks is going to change the next 4 weeks. Part of that is, teams getting tape. Part of that is some coaches just, being proactive. Like, they have tape on us, let's change this. And then some of it's just human nature. You went 0-4, you're feeling great. This other team is, 1-3. They're hungry for a win, So there's things change, and you got to be able to, take what you thought or what you saw week one, and then either make a pivot or readjust, reassess, moving forward. So constantly, hashtag stay ready. When it comes to, we talked about, churning the roster. When you look at your roster, you should constantly be thinking about, how can I make this better? Literally with each waiver wire ad. Is this roster as good as it can be? If it's not, what do I need to do? What can I do to make this roster better? And I think those are sort of kind of like, I think the main things or the main ways that I approach. But really, if you have the passion for it, if you have the time, if you got the money, to get in some of these higher stake leagues, even some of that is like hard for me to swallow, even after the big wins. But I think it all starts with that. If you're competitive, you'll find your way. And we all have different processes. I'm a strong believer there's multiple ways to win. So you just have to start from somewhere.
Yeah, those are great words, man. I really like the thing about loving football, and I think that's something a lot of people miss, especially when you're grinding data and looking at numbers and like what do you see on the field? And I didn't play football competitively myself, but I stinking love it. I love watching it. I love the nuances of the game and what the line play and all that stuff. And I agree when I see a player going off, it's like or running excellent routes or finding holes, a running back with excellent vision or bursts. I remember watching tape on rookies, and I'd love to get you my rookie thoughts after I watched the tape. But I see Todd Gurley running in college, and I'll never forget that. Like, oh my gosh, like the guy just did not look like a college player. He was a man among boys, and I tried to get him everywhere I could. You can just tell if you know football. So yeah, if you're just kind of coming up, watch as much football as you can. That's great advice. Abib, thank you so much for coming on with us. It was a real privilege chatting with you. We're going to wrap up for today. Be on the lookout if you're listening here for our next show. We're going to chat with another successful player and analyst, Heath Cummings from CBS. He'll be next. Make sure you subscribe to the show so you get updated when the next one of the Expert Series comes out. Before I sign off, please consider leaving a rating or review for the podcast. Please spread the word on Twitter to your friends or whoever. Please consider supporting the podcast over at Anchor. The link for that is in the podcast details. That's it. I appreciate you listening. Have a great night. Thanks, Abib.
Thank you.
Take care, man.
Have a good one.